1938 was actually kind of the height of the Hitler regime. Like, people loved him, there was full employment. I mean, there was oppression against the Jews, but if you were like a National Socialist, you thought that was good, basically.
When Norman Oler walked into the Joe Rogan Experience studio, most listeners expected a discussion about his best-selling book Blitzed, Drugs in Nazi Germany. What they didn't expect was the bombshell moment when Oler leaned in and said something that made Joe pause. This wasn't some internet conspiracy theory. Oler's suggestion was rooted in declassified documents, eyewitness contradictions, and unexplored leads buried in Cold War archives.
So meth keeps you up, but it makes you a little bit dumber. Oh. Like things that are really, that demand like abstract, very abstract thinking, or more complex things.
He wasn't trying to be sensational. He was challenging the version of history we've all been told. So what exactly did Norman reveal, and why are so many historians suddenly listening? Let's start with the part of the story no one expected, because that's where the mystery begins. The Joe Rogan interview nobody expected when Norman Oler sat down across from Joe Rogan. It was supposed to be a conversation about Nazi Germany's hidden history, particularly his bestseller Blitzed, which exposed the Third Reich's deep entanglement with drug use. Despite criticizing the moral and physical degradation of the Germans under the Weimar Republic, Hitler's plans for the men in his Reich weren't much better. Oler paints a grim picture of the years under the Nazi regime. The use of methamphetamine was common, he argues in his book, particularly in the form of Pervitin. The drug was manufactured in huge quantities. For example, 35 million tablets were ordered for the Western Campaign in 1940. This seems an impressive figure until you recall that more than 2.4 million troops were involved, making an average of around 15 tablets per soldier for the entire operation. Oler goes much further than claiming that methamphetamine was central to the German military effort. He claims that its use was universal among the civilian population of Germany too. For the ordinary person, Pervitin became a routine grocery item well before the war. Oler provides much detail on the drug regime to which Hitler was subjected by his personal physician, Theodor Morell, especially during the war. His medication, above all Pervitin and Eucodol, an analgesic morphine derivative, propelled Hitler into a world of delusion in which the defeats and disasters of the last 2 years of the war could be brushed aside as irrelevant. His chemically induced confidence hardened his resolve and made him reject all thoughts of compromise. Generals who wanted to stage tactical withdrawals were dismissed by Hitler, intoxicated by the artificial euphoria induced by the pills and injections provided by Morell. That's why some people struggle to believe that he killed himself when the Allies came, he concluded with a shrug. He was too euphoric for such a choice. This passing comment, almost too casually delivered, made Joe raise his eyebrows and say, "Wait, there are people who think Hitler didn't die in the bunker." That was the moment everything changed. Norman Oler isn't a YouTuber chasing clicks. He's not a conspiracy theorist with an agenda. He's a seasoned investigative journalist, a researcher who spent years digging through dusty archives across Germany and Russia. His reputation is built on uncovering stories buried beneath official narratives, ones backed by documents, not internet threads. So when someone like him even hints that the accepted account of Hitler's death might be incomplete, people listen. Joe Rogan did. The studio got quiet for a beat, something rare on JRE. Then Oler clarified, "I'm not saying Hitler definitely escaped. I'm saying we may have been too quick to close that case." He pointed out how many post-war records remained sealed for decades, how intelligence from the Soviets and Allies conflicted, and how the story we all know, that Hitler shot himself in the bunker on April 30th, 1945, relied heavily on witness accounts from people who were either deeply loyal to him or under extreme pressure from occupying forces. It's not that Norman was trying to rewrite history. If anything, he was trying to open it back up. History gets told by those who survive, he said, but sometimes what survives isn't the truth, it's just the version that was convenient at the time. Joe leaned in, visibly intrigued. This wasn't some wild tangent. It was measured, precise, and that's why it hit harder. Ohler wasn't selling a theory. He was raising a question. Why, for instance, was there never a confirmed autopsy by independent parties? Why did Soviet reports about Hitler's death keep changing in the years that followed? And why were Western leaders, including Eisenhower and Stalin, reluctant to confirm that Hitler had really died in the bunker? Ohler pointed out that history isn't made of certainties, it's made of stories, pieced together from limited sources, often influenced by fear, politics, or the simple need to move on. The takeaway wasn't that Hitler survived. The takeaway was that people like Norman Oler, with access to classified materials and first-hand testimonies from people still living in the post-war shadows, are starting to ask the kinds of questions that used to be off-limits. And that made Joe say what would eventually end up on the thumbnail of every clip. It's time to tell everything. That line wasn't about stoking controversy, it was about curiosity, about the duty to investigate, even when the world thinks a story is closed. Because if a respected historian starts asking whether the most definitive ending of the 20th century might not be so definitive after all, you have to wonder, what else have we missed? The bunker story that never fully added up the official story taught in schools and repeated in documentaries for decades is simple and final. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler took his own life in the Führer bunker. He swallowed a cyanide capsule and simultaneously shot himself. His longtime partner, Eva Braun, did the same. Loyal staff burned the bodies in the garden above the bunker and buried what was left. And just like that, the most infamous figure of the 20th century vanished. But the more you dig into that account, the less solid it becomes. That's exactly what caught Norman Oler's attention. During his research, he found that this narrative relied heavily on second-hand Soviet testimony and German eyewitnesses who were either fanatically loyal or terrified for their lives. There was no public autopsy, no widely accepted, independently verified remains. In fact, for years, the Soviets refused to share any physical evidence that Hitler had truly died in the bunker. When they finally did, it was a partial skull fragment and a few teeth that many historians quietly questioned. In 2009, American researchers examined the skull and concluded it belonged to a woman under 40, Eva Braun perhaps, but certainly not Hitler. So what happened? Ohler doesn't claim to know exactly, but he asks what few dare to. Why have we accepted such a hazy version of events as historical truth? As he told Joe Rogan, this is supposed to be the most consequential death of the 20th century. And yet, it's the one backed by the weakest evidence. It's a chilling observation. The final moments of a man whose actions caused millions of deaths, whose face is synonymous with evil, and we don't even have a body. The story we've been told hinges on statements from Hitler's inner circle, his valet, his secretaries, and SS guards. They were interrogated by Soviet forces, sometimes under immense pressure. Some gave conflicting reports. One said Hitler collapsed after the gunshot. Another said he was already dead before the shot was fired. Some said the bodies were completely burned. Others insisted only partially. And then there's Stalin. After the war, the Soviet leader publicly claimed Hitler had escaped. Was it disinformation? Was it a political move to keep the Allies guessing? Possibly. But even that raises questions. Why so doubt? Unless there was doubt to begin with. The bunker itself was quickly sealed, later destroyed. The crime scene was gone. Evidence was fragmented. And history moved forward. Ohler's point isn't to peddle a conspiracy. It's to ask why historians settle for so little when it came to confirming Hitler's fate. The bar for evidence in other war crimes, Nuremberg, for instance, was exceptionally high. But in Hitler's case, vague eyewitness testimony and Soviet-held fragments that surfaced decades later, it's easy to say the official story is correct simply because it's what we've always known. But Ohler's challenge is deeper. If this story holds, let it be confirmed beyond doubt. If it doesn't, why haven't we looked closer? In his words, the world accepted the story it needed, not necessarily the one that was true. And for Joe Rogan's audience, that realization landed hard. The idea that the most pivotal death of modern history might have been wrapped up too cleanly, too quickly, and with too little scrutiny was stunning beyond words. South America. The trail that refused to go cold. By the time Norman Oler sat across from Joe Rogan, the topic had shifted from bunker inconsistencies to something far more unsettling. The long, winding escape routes that led from post-war Europe to the dense, ungoverned corners of South America. They weren't theories, they were facts. Known as rat lines, these secret networks helped dozens, possibly hundreds, of Nazi officials escape justice after World War II. Some were aided by sympathetic clergy. Others had forged documents, but the result was the same: a quiet exodus through Italy and Spain, across the Atlantic, and into places like Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Brazil. High-ranking figures, like Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, were captured in Buenos Aires years later. Joseph Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, lived freely in South America for decades. If those names could vanish into the jungles and cities of the Southern Hemisphere, then the question becomes, why not Hitler? That's exactly what Ohler pressed during his JRE appearance. He wasn't claiming Hitler definitely escaped. He was pointing out that the infrastructure to do so absolutely existed, and for someone as powerful and resourceful as Hitler, the option was real. Ohler then pulled out something unexpected: a series of declassified FBI documents, memos from the 1940s and 1950s, that revealed US agents continued receiving and investigating reports of Hitler sightings years after the war ended. Some of those reports were vague. Others were chillingly specific. A man resembling Hitler living in a German-style village in Argentina, surrounded by bodyguards. One memo labeled the source as reliable, but the investigation was closed for lack of hard proof. Joe Rogan's eyes widened. Wait, if they were sure he was dead, why were they even entertaining this stuff in the 50s? It was a fair question. The reality was, even the Allies weren't entirely unified in their confidence about Hitler's death. British intelligence suspected Stalin was lying about what he knew. American officials quietly compiled escape-related intelligence for years. The Soviets, for their part, deliberately fueled rumors that Hitler had slipped away, perhaps to sow distrust among their Western counterparts, perhaps because they weren't entirely sure either. Ohler pointed to interviews he conducted in Argentina, locals who recalled older German men moving into remote areas in the 1950s. Names weren't shared, photos didn't exist, but the folklore was consistent. Someone powerful had arrived, someone important. In one town there was even talk of a small house buried in the jungle, where outsiders were never welcomed. Of course, stories can be just that. But Ohler's point wasn't to turn folklore into fact. It was to highlight how this ghost trail never went cold. No one ever found remains conclusively tied to Hitler, and yet the US government kept watching, kept listening, and at times kept searching. The dots weren't joined by wild speculation. They were joined by real escapes, real documents, and real questions. Could Hitler have used the same pipeline that got Eichmann out? Could someone with his resources, and with fanatical loyalists still in place, have orchestrated a disappearance while Berlin fell apart above him? I'm not saying he lived out his life in Argentina, Ohler said. I'm saying the door to that possibility was never fully closed. For Joe Rogan's audience, used to blunt truths and unfiltered questions, it wasn't a conspiracy. It was an uncomfortable historical gap, one that, even decades later, refuses to be dismissed. Norman's personal investigations, Norman Oler wasn't content to rely on old documents and dusty archives. As a journalist and researcher, he wanted to walk the paths himself. That's what brought him to South America, Argentina, Chile, and the mountain villages where history sometimes lingers in whispers rather than headlines. When Joe Rogan asked him what really drove him to investigate Hitler's alleged escape route, Ohler didn't flinch. It wasn't about proving a conspiracy, he said. It was about chasing a question that's been dismissed too easily. What he found, there wasn't a smoking gun. There were no signed letters, No photographs of Hitler in the jungle, but there were elderly locals with long memories, families who had lived in the same remote areas since the 1940s. And some of them remembered things that didn't line up with the official story. In one town along the Patagonian border, Ohler was introduced to an elderly man known only as Esteban. Through a translator, Esteban described his father working on a private estate in the early 1950s. The employer, he claimed, was a tall German man with a severe limp and only one functional hand. He never gave a name. He rarely spoke. But everyone on the property treated him with a kind of reverence, fearful, quiet reverence. Esteban's father wasn't allowed to approach the main house. He delivered supplies to a side entrance and left. It was like serving a ghost, the old man said. He was there, but you couldn't talk about him. Ohler didn't present this as confirmation. He was careful, measured. It could have been any former officer, he admitted. But the behavior, the secrecy, and the timeline made me pay attention. In another village, miles deeper into the Andes, a local guide led him to the remains of a stone structure, long since overgrown. It wasn't much, just a wall, a doorway, and fragments of tile. But villagers said it had once been part of a hidden lodge. They called it La Casa del Alemán, the German's house. Rumors said a powerful man stayed there briefly, before vanishing again. Ohler's field notes, photos, and sketches helped paint a pattern, not a proof, but a possibility. Trails of people, places, and legends that all danced around one name, without ever saying it aloud. Back on JRE, Joe listened carefully. So you're not saying he lived there? Ohler shook his head. I'm saying the world built an escape hatch, and the most powerful Nazi of them all had every reason and every resource to use it. It wasn't a bold accusation. It was a quiet observation, one that made the gaps in our historical record feel a little wider. Because at the heart of Norman Ohler's work wasn't a declaration, it was a question. Why does the most consequential death of the 20th century have so few hard facts? And if even one thread in the official story doesn't hold up, how many others deserve a second look? Why this still matters today. As the conversation between Norman Oler and Joe Rogan continued, it became clear that this wasn't about pushing a wild theory. Joe leaned back, looked thoughtful, and said what many listeners were probably thinking. Even if it's just 1% possible, it changes everything we thought we knew. That's the heart of why this story sticks. For decades, the end of World War II has been taught with finality. Hitler died in his bunker. Berlin fell and the Allies won. That closure has become part of global consciousness, an anchor in one of history's darkest chapters. But when someone like Norman Oler, a respected author and grounded researcher, starts pointing out gaps, it doesn't ignite a conspiracy, it reignites a responsibility. Because the truth is, people don't care about this story to sensationalize it. They care because history, when left unquestioned, becomes fragile. It's not about rewriting textbooks. It's about making sure we're not blindly trusting narratives built more on convenience than confirmation. Norman said it best on the show. We ended the most destructive war in human history on a set of assumptions, not on proof. Instead, I brought proof that Hitler might have survived WW2. So what now? His question opens a can of worms. Think about that. We're told that the man responsible for millions of deaths shot himself, was burned beyond recognition, and then disposed of quietly, quickly, without transparency. The Soviets who found the remains offered no body, no photos, and conflicting stories over the years. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was still tracking rumors of his survival well into the 1950s. So why close the case? Norman's argument isn't that we need to reopen every dusty archive. It's that historians, especially today, have a duty to question neat conclusions, to look again, to follow leads even when they seem unlikely. Joe Rogan echoed this frustration. You talk to people about this, he said, and they act like it's ridiculous to even ask. But isn't that how bad history is? When we decide we already know the ending, what Ohler's story does is challenge that idea. It doesn't replace facts with fiction. It shines a light where we stopped looking. And in the bigger picture, it's not just about Hitler. It's about what we accept as truth and who we trust to define it. This chapter of their discussion struck a chord with viewers, especially younger audiences who didn't grow up with Cold War narratives or 20th century propaganda. For them, learning that the official story of Hitler's death might have holes isn't just shocking, it's a call to stay curious. That's why this conversation matters, because whether Hitler died in that bunker or not, what's undeniable is that history left room for doubt, and that space, that 1% chance Joe talks about, is enough to shift how we see the past, enough to question how many other moments in history were tied up too neatly. It's time to tell everything. By the end of the conversation on Joe Rogan's podcast, something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the tone of the story itself. Norman Oler sat across from Joe, no longer speaking like a researcher delivering facts. He sounded more like a witness to something heavier, something unfinished, something the world was never really meant to forget. You know, Norman said slowly, it's time we tell everything, not because it's dramatic, but because it's overdue. That line hit like a slow echo. It wasn't delivered with fire or some attempt to stir controversy. It was said with conviction, with a strange kind of peace too. Like someone who had spent years wrestling with unanswered questions, only to realize that maybe the value wasn't in the answers, but in the asking. Joe nodded, eyebrows raised, voice quiet. Man, that's heavy. And he was right. This wasn't a wild theory spiraling into conspiratorial territory. It was a story about history, about silence, about the cost of not asking more. Oler's point wasn't that he knew Hitler escaped. It's that the evidence we've built the official story on feels suspiciously thin for such a monumental event. And the more he traveled, listened, and dug, the more that silence started to feel intentional. Not in a grand cover-up sense, but in the way history sometimes prefers easy endings over unresolved truths. He told Joe, I've interviewed people in South America who spoke in riddles. They weren't trying to convince me of anything. They were just tired of being ignored. That's what makes this interview so powerful. It reflects what Norman brought to the table, not proof in the form of a smoking gun, but proof that the official story doesn't hold up under serious scrutiny. And maybe that's more important, because in a world drowning in information, the real danger isn't wild theories, it's apathy. It's assuming we already know the truth when no one's actually checked the foundation in decades. This chapter of the interview didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, a passing of the torch from one researcher to a curious audience, saying, don't just listen to what I said. Go read, go dig, go ask questions. Even Joe, who's known for his open mind, paused before speaking again. You could see it land. The idea that something we've accepted for generations might not be fully true. Not for the sake of controversy, but because it deserves another look. Norman's message was never about rewriting history books overnight. It was about giving permission to wonder, to admit we may have rushed to close a chapter that was still being written. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing about a mystery isn't that it exists, it's that people stopped looking for it. What if, in our rush for closure, we buried the questions that still matter?